a little bit about the role of technology, because we are dealing, obviously, in this talk with communication technology. And so I think it's helpful to clarify what is significant about communication technology in this kind of a question. And then two, on top of that, look at the business model of these communications platforms, because those two things combined to help give us, I think, a better understanding of how this system operates and how we have arrived at this particular architecture of design. Okay, so in terms of the communication technology, here's just a couple of, I think, important points to clarify. And that is what we would say, that is with each major transition in media technology, that is the means of communication, there's a parallel transformation or restructuring of human consciousness, cognition, and human society. In other words, the point that I'm stressing here, and that people who study technology will reiterate, is that when we're talking about technology generally, but more specifically communication technology, as I try to point out here in the second paragraph, when you add new communication technologies, you don't have the old society plus the new technology. You have an entirely different society. So as I put it here, with each transformation, it is not simply the old society with the added advantage of a new technology, but in many respects, a new society. So early modern society was not simply the old society with the added advantage of the printing press, when the printing press was introduced, new important communication technology. Instead, what you had in many respects was a new society because of the printing press. It created a fundamental transformation of being, social relationships, consciousness, etc. That's what makes communication technology, I think, significant, which is worth, I think, reiterating before we get too much further. So here would be just sort of a short list of some of the major technological innovations in terms of communication technology. So you have the printing press, the telegraph, the radio, wireless radio, the television, and then, of course, the internet. And so, again, the point that I would stress here is that with each of these innovations, it wasn't the old society plus the new technology. The new communication technology fundamentally reordered, restructured the society. And that is very true, obviously, when we're talking about something like the role of the internet and more recently, social media. Now, what about the business model? So the basic business model of modern media systems is the centrality of something called the attention economy or attention capture. In other words, one question that comes up a lot is, what exactly is the product that is being bought and sold in the media industry? The answer is your attention. So the logic of the attention economy is that all media platforms are designed to buy and sell the attention of users and audiences. Once captured, the attention of users and audiences is then sold or delivered to the advertiser for a fee and or harvested for personal data, particularly if we're talking about social media. And then the fee, of course, is determined by the time on site or the total number of targeted users, meaning the size of the audience and the demographic characteristics of the users, because advertisers care a lot about that as well. And so what that then leads to is a situation in which the design architecture incentivizes time on site attention capture. And so to understand the way things are prioritized on social media in particular, you have to understand the underlying basic economic imperative, which again is maximizing time on site that then privileges certain kind of content over other kinds of content, because there are certain kinds of content that are known to keep people on the site, and then there are other kinds of content that are known to keep people fairly quickly leaving the site. And so that's, again, another really important factor in considering the kind of questions that we want to explore here. Okay, so let's then move on specifically to the digital technology. So the first problem, and getting back to this idea of normative communication, is we often make a distinction between normative and strategic discourse. And that is to say that under these conditions, remember, normative communication is the foundation of democracy, but it's often contrasted with something called strategic communication. Strategic communication is about me winning the argument, me in some way degrading my opponent, doing whatever I have to take to win. So it's about manipulation. It's about influence. It's not about reaching some kind of mutual understanding about some important pressing issue. And so one of the arguments that I'm going to explore here is how the architecture of the design, given the economic incentives, has the effect of undermining how we understand, again, this very important idea of normative communication. So here's the clarification, sort of the formal, I think, distinction by Habermas, who spent a good part of his career studying these kinds of questions. And so he says normative communication is the objective, which is shared understanding between adversaries, depends on reason and evidence in an atmosphere completely free of any non-rational coercive influences. That's normative communication. That is the foundation of democratic discourse. That's the discursive foundation I mentioned earlier. Strategic communication, as I was mentioning earlier as well, the objective is simply to manipulate adversaries into compliance. Again, it's about winning. Leads to communicative distortions. It's used to create communication that is instrumentally guided rather than directed towards some kind of truth or mutual understanding. So keeping those two distinctions in mind in terms of how we understand communication, let's consider some findings from some recent research. Now, this is just the latest in a long line of research in which some of these basic ideas have been replicated. And that is meeting the basic principles of group psychology, how connectivity brings out our worst. So we start with the premise that human beings are social animals. Being part of strong communities makes us feel more secure. Performing, therefore, group membership by publicly espousing group values through words and actions is a way for people to strengthen ties to the communities they value and prove that they are members in good standing. So again, this is just basic group psychology. Understanding that, then, we need, as a result, to belong and to feel connected, which is a very powerful pull in terms of how we live our lives, how we interact. And so what the findings show, based on some of these basic psychological principles, and that is that there are few things that tighten the bonds of community or make the weak feel more powerful like attacking an apparent outsider. So in other words, if you think about a lot of the kind of discourse that happens on social media, where it's kind of back and forth scoring points against your political adversary, there's a very good reason for that. And not only is that the kind of communication that is prioritized, again, given the economic incentives that we discussed, maximizing time on site, and then also just sort of the architecture which prioritizes that kind of communication. It creates this kind of a dynamic when you add to this the basic group psychology, in which you get a kind of proliferation of what's called moralized content, which again would be antithetical to how we understand normative communication. So that's one thing. Amplifying outgroup animosity, building on that somewhat, and that is, as a result, research suggests the fundamental human psychology, as much as any ideological cause, because most of this is less about ideology than this kind of in-group, out-group conflict, can lead online groups to organize around some focus of hate or antipathy. This encourages the group's members to make ever-escalating attacks, less for political ends, then it's a kind of performance of solidarity with the group and its ideals. So in other words, one thing we can say about how all this works is a lot of the discourse that happens on social media is a way effectively of signaling your loyalty to your group, your antipathy toward the outgroup. And nothing, as we said earlier, can do that more effectively than this kind of moralized speech, which often involves things like, for example, hate speech and so on. Because of context collapse, that just means that you're going to be interacting with all kinds of people outside your day in and day out interactions. They call this co-presence, right? So when you're dealing with a person face to face, there is a context. With social media, that context collapses. Now you're communicating with anybody who happens to be online anywhere in the world. Inherent to social media, normal constraints on this behavior, because very often, if you were in a face-to-face conversation with somebody, that would place certain constraints on how you would behave, how you would speak, etc. Such as the risk of consequences like social disapproval or punishment tend to be much weaker online, letting these impulses run rampant. So briefly, without getting into all of the weeds on the research, what the findings are beginning to show in a form that kind of replicates over and over the same basic idea, and that is, given how we understand human psychology, the need to belong to groups, the need to signal our solidarity with the group, combine that with the incentives of digital technology, the design architecture, along with the economic imperatives of this technology, you get this kind of pattern of speech, which, as we've all, I hope, understand now, is not exactly how we would define normative communication, right? This is very much in line with how we understand strategic communication, which makes anything like the discursive possibilities for democracy almost impossible to achieve. Okay, so in sum, on the first point, evidence suggests the design architecture of digital communication technology incentivizes strategic communication over normative communication. So that would be one point, looking at this in terms of the three areas we want to cover. So let's move on to the second area. Digital media and the erosion of truth. So again, in order for any of this to work the way we understand democracies and these discursive foundations I've been talking about, it presupposes we're dealing with reality. We're dealing with verifiable, demonstrable truth. So then the question is, how social media enables an ecosystem of unreality. So let's clarify, though, why truth matters and just sort of get a better sense of what this really means. So Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, I think has probably the best way of setting this up as a framework. She talks about truth, and she specifically distinguishes two types of truth: factual truth and rational truth. Factual truth concerns events, particularly historic events and circumstances. So, for example, I can say Elvis Presley died August 16th, 1977. George Washington was the first president of the United States. That is a factual truth. Okay. In other words, we're not going to have a debate about who the president of the United States was, who the first president of the United States was. That is a generally understood truth. And then there's rational truth, which deals mostly with mathematical, scientific, philosophical truth. So we're not going to have a big debate about does 2 + 2 = 4 or does it equal 5? And that's not going to be the subject of debate. Or the scientific consensus on the causes of climate change. Now, there's a big political debate about climate change, but there's no scientific debate. Okay. And so the point that she's making then is that the way democracies work is you have the basic foundations of factual and rational truth, and all the stuff that goes on in terms of the debate has to do with the interpretations of the factual, rational truth. So we can have a debate. Was George Washington a good president? Was he not? We can have different opinions about that. We can have vehement arguments about that. We can bring in evidence to make our point. But we're not going to have a debate that's going to have any meaning about whether or not George Washington was the first president of the United States. That's when things start going off the rails, right? And so again, the basic foundations are factual, rational truth. And then the substance of democratic debate and discourse are the different opinions or interpretations about that truth. Okay. But the wider problem, as she identifies it, though, and this is where you start getting into a potential problem, is that the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lies will now be accepted as truth and the truth defamed as lies, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. And then she says later that the ideal subject of totalitarianism, meaning the opposite of democracy, are people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. So in other words, what she is cautioning the readers about is that if you look at how democracies collapse, because that was really the subject of her study, The Origins of Totalitarianism, what she found was a complete breakdown in any ability to base debate and argument on factual and rational truth. When that is gone, you are now in the realm that she tries to identify here, in which we're really not able to distinguish what is true from what is false. So as she said, it's not that you're walking around with your head filled with lies that's the problem. The problem is you can't tell the difference. And when you get to the point that you can't tell the difference, that's when you are in trouble, according to Arendt, again, thinking in terms of what this might mean for democracy and the threat to democracy. So if that's true, then how do we deal with the role that technology plays? And that is, we're going to say that there are two interrelated ways, although I'm going to focus primarily on one, having to do with the widespread circulation and amplification of disinformation. So let's delve into that a little bit. But first, let's get a better idea of how we understand what is and what is not true, how this traditionally would be understood to operate. And so we think about the constitution of knowledge as a kind of a funnel. And so at the very top, at the wide end, people are free to think whatever they want. Right? So if you want to think that there never was a person who existed called George Washington, you're free to think that. That's free speech. So you can float that hypothesis if you want. George Washington was an imposter, right, or whatever. Only an infinitesimal fraction of these ideas, however, that are floated out there at the top of the funnel are going to be proven true. Eventually, the surviving propositions are accepted into the canon of knowledge. Now, what determines the difference? Something called friction. So in other words, when I make the claim there was no such person as George Washington, to use that example, the way this would work is that would have to be tested. What evidence is there that there never was a person called George Washington? Or what is the evidence that there actually was such a person? In other words, friction means you're testing the truth, you're running it through hypotheses, you're running it through experiments, observations, etc. That's what friction means. So that by the time a proposition comes to be basically accepted, George Washington was the first president of the United States, you have some confidence that that in fact is the case. That's the difference. Right? Okay. So again, I'm using the example of George Washington just to sort of have a consistent reference, but this would apply to all claims about anything. Okay. So the way that this would work in terms of traditional pre-digital forms of transmitting information, that is, you would discover a piece of information, a fact of some sort, then you would verify it. Again, that's running it through this process of, fact checking, looking for the evidence, and so on. And then once it's gone through that, then it's amplified. Then it reaches the public. But it doesn't reach the public until it's gone through this process. That would be the traditional kind of pre-digital way of thinking about how information gets out to the public, and the fact that for the most part, there is a method in place to verify it. Now you add more kind of electronic mediums, radio, television, etc. It's the same basic process, right? In other words, you discover information, you verify it, you check it. Is it true? Is it false? What's the evidence for this, etc.? Then you amplify it. Now with electronic communication, you can amplify it much wider than you could before this technology came along, when we were dealing primarily with print. Okay, so now let's fast forward to today, and now you get something called digital epistemology, and that is, given the priorities of the attention economy to maximize engagement, social media creates a distribution platform that in effect privileges disinformation. And that's how this looks, right? Because what you see missing here is what? The friction. So it can go from I have an idea, I have some piece of information, and now it goes out and it's amplified very widely with no intervening fact-checking friction, as we would call it. So that's one of the big, I think, fundamental changes in terms of how we take in information that we may not necessarily be aware of, because it operates often kind of behind the scenes, and that is this friction process. And what we see with digital media is that it doesn't exist. So what this encourages then is the very fast distribution of content, meaning it's going to be very often unverifiable, urgent, lacking context, and emotional, because that's exactly the kind of stuff that increases engagement, as opposed to slower. Slower would be sourced, accurate, in context, reliable. And what we know is that the slower content doesn't do as well, given these incentives of the attention economy and the economic imperatives, etc., than faster information. And the problem here, in terms of questions of truth, is that it's the faster information that is most likely to be inaccurate in some way, if not just outright disinformation. Which in turn then encourages what psychologists call fast thinking versus slow thinking. So fast thinking is automatic, it's unconscious, it's emotional, it's reactive. Slow thinking, deliberative, effortful, reliable, reflective. So I don't have to tell you which one of these is more consistent with the idea of normative communication. Again, the discursive foundations of democracy presuppose slow thinking. Fast thinking was to be avoided when we're having serious discussions about serious policy questions and so on. Okay, and so there is some empirical evidence for this. There have been many such studies, but this is one that got a lot of attention, and that is that social media's amplification of disinformation, the grim conclusions of the largest ever study. And what they did basically show that for all categories of information, whatever the particular area, we found the false stories spread significantly further, faster, and more broadly than did true ones. Again, largely for some of the reasons that we just discussed. Falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted. These effects were more pronounced for false political stories than for any other type of false news, which of course would be very relevant to our discussion here, because we are talking ultimately about politics. And so here's how that mapped out. And so again, as you can see here, the information that would be sort of consistent with information that is slow content, requiring slow thinking, that's the true stuff, doesn't get very far. The stuff that is fast thinking, fast content, which is all very much in line with the economic incentives, the digital architectural design of the technology, is the rapid, fast, widespread of false information. So that doesn't mean that the truth has gone away. It just means that it can't really compete very well with information that is false. And then here's another study that was done recently where they looked at, they were able to track people's activities on Facebook. And as you can see towards the left, when they were doing all the kind of mundane stuff that people might do on Facebook, you know, sharing family photos, etc., didn't get a lot of, you know, interest. But then as soon as they started spreading conspiracy theories, in this case, conspiracy theories about the stolen election, look what happens. You see towards the right. Engagement jumps up significantly. And again, the reason for that is, as we were saying earlier, this is the kind of information that you can share as a way of signaling your loyalty to your group and your antipathy toward the outgroup. But it's also the kind of information, because it's false, it's going to tend to just be more interesting. It's going to be more engaging. It's more provocative. It's more incendiary. So the whole architecture, again, is designed in such a way, the incentives are designed in such a way to favor or to privilege or to incentivize false information. So in sum, the evidence suggests the digital architecture of digital communication technology incentivizes the proliferation of disinformation, untruth generally, resulting in the deterioration of epistemic norms, overwhelming our capacity to govern ourselves as reasonable or competent citizens in a democracy. So let's look at the last issue here. This is the proliferation of conspiracy theories, which sort of builds on what we've been talking about already so far today. And this is how the pluralism is ultimately undermined and kind of produces something called political sectarianism. Because there is, we'll get to this here shortly, a new way of thinking about how conspiracy theories operate in this kind of information ecosystem. I want to clarify. And that is, remember I said earlier in this talk that one of the foundations of a democratic system is this pluralism idea. This is the agreeing to disagree, right? So we expect that groups will try to maximize their interests, of course, and that lines of conflict are multiple and shifting, as power is a continuous bargaining process between competing groups. Again, that's sort of why democracy is so complicated. But critically, pluralism necessitates the acceptance, maybe not, the joyful acceptance, but at least the resigned acceptance of the opposition's legitimacy as the loyal opposition. That's the term that's often used. Okay, so getting back to the issue of conspiracy, then how do these work? Well, there is something that's been recognized, sometimes just referred to as the new conspiracism. And that is, whereas classic conspiracies develop theories in an attempt to explain seemingly inexplicable events. So the JFK assassination, 9/11, the moon landing, etc., as you may or may not know, there are very elaborate conspiracy theories about those issues, right? And they do have a kind of a scholarly air to them. So if you've ever looked at some of the literature on something like the JFK assassination, it does look very scholarly. There are pages and pages of footnotes and that kind of thing. In other words, there is an attempt to create some kind of, again, connection, some kind of evidence. What sets this way, meaning new conspiracism, apart, is the substitution of an explanation of events with a complex web of allusions, claims, and accusations. There's no effort to gather facts, no connecting of the evidentiary dots to construct an internally consistent narrative, however baseless it may be. With the aid of social media's algorithmic repetition, amplification, and validation, these conspiracies work primarily to demonize political opponents and undermine faith and delegitimate the very idea of democratic pluralism. In other words, based on what we've talked about so far in terms of the basic interaction between human psychology, group dynamics, and this technology, in addition to what we just talked about in terms of the proliferation of disinformation and untruth as a result of these factors, you now add into that mix new conspiracism, and you get sort of the makings of the problem that we're trying to identify here. The result, as it relates to all this, is something called epistemic polarization. And that is, we're a nation divided not just by ideology, and ideology actually is fairly insignificant, right, in our politics today, but by different perceptions of reality itself. So if you start looking at I'll show you just a couple of examples. We could spend a lot of time on this, but a couple of examples to illustrate this point, that there is a kind of an asymmetry here in terms of reality versus unreality. And so what we're seeing more and more is the debates are not so much about ideology. And we saw this earlier in terms of the basic kind of discourse that happens. Again, now what we're looking at is maybe the logical conclusion of this, and that is living in entirely different epistemic universes. So here's one study, right? Something called Plandemic. Needless to say, there are a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding COVID, and this was one of them. And again, it wasn't sort of a good faith effort to sort of reconcile some contradictory information. It was done primarily to discredit those who were claiming that the pandemic is something we should take seriously. So if you go back and look at the domestic politics at the time, there was a kind of partisan dimension to the way we were talking about COVID, the way we're talking about how best to respond, et cetera. And this is just one element in that process. Again, one among many we could look at, but this one has been quite well documented. And again, as you can see, it fits the same pattern we've discussed before. And that is the truthful information about something like COVID. It's going to suffer all the same kinds of disadvantages that we identified, right? Again, it's slow content, produces slow thinking, which in many ways is at odds with the way this entire system is set up to work. But then you get something like Plandemic, which is basically just a baseless conspiracy made up of a bunch of different claims, no real attempt to provide evidence, and you can see the kind of reach that something like this can get. And this is just one of many of these kinds of conspiracies. So the results of this are that there has been a proliferation of these conspiracy theories, and there is a real-world consequence of this that you may or may not be aware of, and that is those who tended to get their information from news sources and platforms that trafficked a lot in this kind of disinformation, took fewer precautions to protect themselves from the virus, were more likely, therefore, to contract the virus and more likely, therefore, to die from the virus. In other words, there is a kind of real life and death consequence that results from and has resulted from this kind of epistemic polarization that I mentioned. Only now, lately, we've been having a similar conversation having to do with vaccines, right? So it's the same basic idea. There's an example of this right now. And as you can see, where there are high vaccination rates, that COVID is well under control, and where there are low vaccination rates, COVID is out of control. Lately, it's been places like Missouri and Florida. And again, there's a partisan dimension to this. There's no question about that. And this, again, would be the result of some of what we've been talking about up to this point so far. So what we then can say as a consequence of this epistemic polarization, again, new conspiracism being one, I think, a significant example of that, is what you find here, and that is basically what you're seeing is a greater antipathy toward the out party. So they have these measures of warm and neutral, and the one that really stands out, if you look at the bottom chart, out party hate. So the lower it goes, the more the out party is hated. Not, again, disliked, but outright hated. And that's, again, part of more and more of the research that is indicating that, again, we're beyond the question of having different opinions about issues, different competing political philosophies. Again, we're now at this point where we're living in entirely different worlds. There's the epistemic inequality, and we're getting to see some of the results of this in these kinds of findings. Here again is the same thing. So the lower the line is going, the greater the antipathy toward the out party. So it's not as though people have a greater love for their own party. They just have a greater hatred for the out party. And here again is the same thing. So polarization, as you can see, is sort of reaching unprecedented levels and has been for some time. So some examples of this, just a few. 66% of Republicans, in this country, the Republicans are one half of the political equation. We have two parties, Democrats and Republicans. But we have one half of the equation believe that the election was stolen. So this would be a piece of disinformation. This is an example of a new conspiracism, because what is it based on? Claims, illusions, and so on, but no actual evidence. But nevertheless, it is believed to be true by a significant proportion of one of the two major parties. That would be, I think, another piece of evidence that strongly supports the assertion that we are, again, reaching this level of epistemic polarization. 50% of Trump supporters essentially believe the QAnon conspiracy. This is the idea that Democrats are involved in child sex trafficking, among other things. So here again, it's a new conspiracy, QAnon. What is there any theory there? No, not really. Again, it's just a bunch of claims, it's a bunch of illusions, and so on. And so, but nevertheless, there is some strong belief. And then the storming of the Capitol. Again, this is not a good sign in terms of pluralism, because remember, pluralism means that you win some, you lose some, right? You're not happy about losing the election, but we're going to try harder next time. That's not what we're seeing now. So something like the riot, the insurrection on January 6th is kind of the logical culmination of a lot of what we're talking about here, because that's what happens when you get to this level of political sectarianism. Pluralism has essentially collapsed under these conditions. So we would say is that the evidence suggests the design architecture of digital communication technology explains in part why a significant proportion of the electorate views the opposing political party as fundamentally illegitimate, thereby seriously undermining the foundational principle of democratic pluralism. So one last thing just to sort of add as a caveat, and that is, while it would be overly simplistic to say digital technology is by itself the cause of all of the patterns that we've identified, but rather that it is the result of a complex interaction between the technology and an array of social, cultural, political factors. So what I've been doing here, obviously, mostly is focusing on the technology, but we do have to, I think, acknowledge that this is happening within a very specific social, cultural, and political context, which is probably amplifying some of the patterns that I've identified. Okay, so with that then, I can take some questions. So we've got, I think, about 10 minutes or so. That hopefully I can. So Stephen.
You obviously spent this whole presentation talking about, the ways in which social media and the internet are undermining our democracy. But do you think those those aspects of social media which harm democracy can they be worked out or removed or limited, or do you think social media is irrevocably harmful?
That is the big question. In my classes, I teach classes in media and politics, and this is one of the recurring questions. And that is, so we sort of what we've done here is diagnose the problem. What you're asking for are solutions. What is the prognosis, right? And that gets difficult because part of this has to do with the tradition of free speech in this country. In other words, we have, at least at this point in our history, a kind of a fundamentalist view about free speech, because any solution might end up limiting speech to some degree. You also have the power of these tech companies, these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and others, who might be resistant to any kind of regulations that might impede with their ability to maximize profits. So there are technological solutions to this. The difficulty would be implementing them in the current kind of political environment. But that is the big question. Now, one thing, just to sort of throw this out there, that's been suggested is something like media literacy, because there's sort of a supply side and a demand side, right? So what we're looking at here is essentially the supply side. The demand side has to do with, well, why are people so unable to distinguish what is true from what is false? Because we do have that ability to do that, right? Again, this is well within our intellectual capacity. But a lot of it just because we don't really understand how all this is working. And so there has been talk of, one way around the First Amendment issues, one way around, the regulatory questions and so on, would be to, introduce a kind of, again, a real serious curriculum, the same way we teach math and English and writing and all that kind of thing, of media literacy, because the stakes are pretty high, right? Again, so that would be something that often comes up in these conversations as well. But that is the big question in many ways. So Yashika.
Yeah. So my question is regarding the design architecture of advertising, where monopolies like Facebook know more about the product, us, really,
right,
than the
absolutely.
people we're meant to connect with. how does that help either democracies if they maybe politicians find out more about us, and then how does that also help like social life? Two different things.
Right. Well, that's another asymmetry, right? And that is they know way more about you than you know about them. There is a term to describe this phenomenon called surveillance capitalism, which has to do with all the data that's collected about you and then used to better sort of target you with specific advertising messages and so on. But that raises all kinds of other questions as well, right, in terms of how this impedes democracy, because the surveillance capitalism really gets into the issue of to what degree can we say we are autonomous, self-determining agents in a system in which there is this kind of asymmetry of knowledge. Because the whole point of surveillance capitalism is to take all the uncertainty out of your behavior. So what they would like to do based on everything they know about you is to kind of guide and nudge your behavior. Because what they really want to be able to predict is what you're going to be doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and so on. And assuming they are successful at doing that, then that would raise a lot of very deep questions about, well, if that's true, are we really autonomous? Are we really self-determining? If the parameter of the choices that I look at have been prescribed by this technology. Because it may feel like I'm making a democratic choice, given the range of options that I have before me. But what I might not recognize is that those options themselves have been very circumscribed by this process. But yeah, I think that's another area we could get into. But the surveillance capitalism would be the problem. So Gabrielle.
We've established that social media overall has had a pretty negative impact on how we do politics and how relevant truth is to politics. But in the future, could it be possible that if we've managed to implement media literacy into classes and universalize that information, could social media really be a powerful tool for democracy instead of hindering it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you go back and look at the early days of the internet, and then maybe even the early days of social media, it was looked at as potentially revolutionizing democracy. I mean, in many ways, kind of what you're describing. But I think along the way, again, certain things were recognized from the standpoint of the business models, the technology, and so on, that unintentionally have had sort of the effects that we're describing here. So yes, the technology, again, there's a whole other kind of discussion we could have about the values that go into the design of the technology itself and how the design is applied and so on. And so we could imagine a world, sort of hypothetically, in which a different set of values was embedded in the design. And the values would be the values that are more consistent with democracy. Because currently the values are mostly market values, not political values. They have political consequences, of course, but the values are maximizing shareholder value. That's designed into the very architecture itself, as I've been trying to stress, and then also just the basic imperatives and the incentives of the owners of the platforms. But if you could remove that element and reinsert into all of this the values of democracy, then these could be remarkable technologies, right, under those conditions for sure. Because, again, as I started out this talk with, the basic foundation of democracy is this kind of discursive competence, which is described by Habermas as, normative communication. What we have now is this sort of overwhelming issue is now with strategic communication, as he would call it. So Cheng.
Yeah, so is it possible for such a surveillance capitalism to bring about a sort of win-win situation? Because because the information company knows so much about us that they're able to use their arithmetic technology to give us the information we want, like the product we maybe we want to buy because it is able to satisfy our needs. So like the companies is able to earn their revenue, and we're able to purchase the products we want.
Well, yeah, I mean, if I understand your question, I think the way in which it is sort of sold as an idea is precisely what you're describing, and that is, in many ways, it does sort of make the whole process a lot more streamlined, right? In other words, I'm only getting ads that are relevant to me, for example, which might be nice, right? Because there are all kinds of things I'm not interested in. There are certain things I am interested in. And so if I don't have to go through all that clutter of stuff that I just don't care about, and I'm only, being exposed to ads that are relevant to me, again, that's a selling point, right? And there's no dispute about the fact that economically, this is a remarkable combination, right? Of, design architecture, again, the way in which it overlaps with human psychology, which is what keeps us on the platform so long, etc. There's no dispute about that. The question is, what's the trade-off? And there's more and more evidence, as I tried to suggest in my talk, that it's starting to add up to a situation in which we can imagine democracy becoming unworkable. Because it would be difficult to see how something like what we just described could be sustained for the long term. But that's a big question for sure.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I think we may be out of time. Well, thank you so much for showing up, for listening. Feel free if you have any questions. I believe you've got my contact info. Feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have